Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this NATO strategic concept webinar we are organizing today. I have two distinguished guests and specialists on this topic. We are going to be talking about the Madrid Summit. As you know, NATO is having a major summit in Madrid, Spain this week. And one of the highlights is going to be the strategic concept of NATO that will be announced. I have with me today Professor Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow with Council on Foreign Relations, but he's also a professor at Georgetown University. And we have also Professor Mustafa Kibaroğlu. He's with MEF University in Turkey. He's actually currently in Madrid. He's joining us from Madrid. Hopefully he has already heard quite a bit about what might come out in that strategic concept. But what we wanted to discuss, last week, as you know, we discussed Turkey's position on Sweden and Finland's membership. And this week we wanted to address this one of the main agenda items, which is the announcement regarding the NATO strategic concept. The last concept, it was announced in 2010, and there has been a lot of debate on that document and how China does not feature, the word doesn't even exist in that document. And then there is a commitment to a strategic dialogue with Russia at the time. And NATO declares that NATO is not a threat to Russia in that document in 2010. Of course, much has changed since then. For the past 2 years, NATO has been mentioning China. Last year's communique from Brussels Summit included China among many other new challenges that the NATO alliance is faced with, including cyber, migration, climate change, among others. So we can probably guess that the strategic concept will address many of these issues, but we would like to discuss what kind of what it should include and how the emphasis on various subjects will influence the future of NATO, because this document is supposed to serve as the guiding document until 2030 for the next decade. So without further ado, I want to start with Professor Kupchan. Charlie, could you tell us what, from an American perspective, what do you think we should expect from this document that will be announced this week? As you know, just today, General Secretary of NATO, Stoltenberg, he announced that the NATO response force will increase from 40,000 to well over 300,000. That's a huge increase. What do you think the goal might be there? And then what are the things that you think should be addressed in this document?
Thank you, Kadir. Good to join you, and good to share the platform with Mustafa. I think there are probably three big baskets when it comes to sketching out NATO's agenda moving forward. One of them, and this is the issue that will dominate the summit, is the return of a traditional agenda to European security. And by that I mean NATO is back in business as a collective defense organization whose top priority, at least for now, is defending the democracies of Europe against Russia. And that's really new, because since the end of the Cold War, NATO has been doing lots of things, but not really focusing on collective defense against Russia. I think it's safe to say that even after 2014, when Russia annexed illegally Crimea and intervened in Donbass, there wasn't an acute sense of a Russian threat There was concern about what Russia had done. There was a decision to deploy what was called an enhanced forward presence to the 3 Baltic countries and to Poland. These were relatively small forces, around 1,500, handled by different groups of NATO members. The United States began to invest more in European defense, but I think it's safe to say that NATO was not animated and focused on its traditional mission of defense against Russia. Moving forward, it will be. And you mentioned, Kadir, the increase in the force strength of the readiness group to go from 40,000 to several 100,000. That's a big deal. I think we're likely to see a major presence of US troops on the ground. I guess the force levels have almost doubled since the Ukraine war began. I don't think those forces are going to leave anytime soon. So we're really seeing the reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank. We are seeing more forces getting ready for potential action in Europe. I'm not someone who believes that the war in Ukraine is about to spill over to NATO territory, but it is a risk that certainly cannot be discounted, whether because of an accident in Ukraine or Russia decided to take a strike against arms that are coming in from Poland. We now see new tensions in Lithuania over the enforcement of sanctions. Who knows what the Russians might do vis-a-vis Lithuania and access to Kaliningrad. So one big theme is returning NATO to its traditional agenda and restructuring the alliance, its forces, its readiness, its capability to reflect that new priority. The second issue is China. And it's clear that NATO has been edging over the last few years toward greater focus on China. I think here in the United States, the current view is that Russia poses the most imminent threat to Atlantic security, but that China poses the more significant threat over the long term, simply because of its growing capability, both economic and military, as well as its technological sophistication. What role NATO plays in the Asia Pacific remains to be determined. I don't expect to see NATO go global. I do not expect to see NATO start deploying forces to Japan or South Korea. On the other hand, there is a lot that can be done to help coordinate US-European approaches to China on strategic issues, on technological issues, on trade issues. I think you'll see more NATO members showing up in the Asia Pacific, not as part of a NATO task force, but as allies interested in increasing their naval presence in the Western Pacific. So this is an issue that will grow more important over time, and I do expect the strategic concept to put some flesh on the bones in terms of the role that the Atlantic partners can play in dealing with the rise of China, which is going to change the 21st century. We haven't seen a significant shift in the structure of the system of international politics really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The rise of China is a game changer. The third issue that I think needs to be touched on is how to handle what is clearly an increasingly complex and interconnected security agenda. Even though the war in Ukraine constitutes a traditional threat, military force, tanks, missiles, it's very clear that this traditional invasion, a ground invasion, a land grab, has impacts across different issue areas. It affects energy security. Energy security affects the climate agenda. we're looking at huge impact on migration, not just because of Ukrainians flowing out, but we might see further knock-on migration effects because of food shortages. In other words, the war is having a direct impact on the food supply. So everything is connected to everything. Obviously, the cyber issue, the digital governance issue, and I'll be interested to see how the strategic concept grapples with the ever more diverse and ever more complex security agenda. Let me end, Kadir, just with a couple reflections on what the tougher issues. One you've already talked about last week, and that is Swedish and Finnish accession. I'm someone who believes that this is an issue that will be resolved. I think the Turkish objection is slowing but not blocking this issue, and so I think that over time this issue will pass. The other issue that I find of the utmost concern, and we'll be interested to see how NATO grapples with it, the G7 has at least begun to scratch the surface, is the political and economic knock-on effects of the war in Ukraine. The increasing inflation, the prospect of food shortages, gas prices here in the United States, food prices here in the United States, the impact of migration on European politics. I think we need to pay increasing attention to how the war in Ukraine is affecting domestic politics in our societies, because I think this is an issue of growing concern. Unity has so far been very impressive within NATO across the Atlantic. I do think we have to ask, how long is that unity going to last as food prices and gas prices go up, and as Europeans and Germans could potentially face, as the cold weather sets in, gas rationing, gas shortages, German industry not getting the energy that it might need. Managing the domestic politics of the war in Ukraine strikes me as an increasingly urgent issue. I will stop there.
Thank you, Charles. Professor Kibaroğlu, please, floor is yours. Feel free to respond to some of what Charlie already said, but I would like you to also give us a overall framework of what you think we should expect and what this document should cover.
Thank you very much, Kadir. It's a great pleasure for me to be back to this screen. I always find SEDA's panels very useful, and not only because I'm attending, but also because I have the opportunity to listen to really wise people speaking, like Charles Kupchan. And it's a great pleasure to see him again after some 20 years. That was back in Georgetown Leadership Seminar back in March 2002, where we met, and he had addressed the audience and raised a lot of points about the forthcoming sort of conjunctural developments, and he was right on many points, as he is right now. And I agree on a number of issues that he raised. He drew up a large picture, big frame within which we can really pick anyone and discuss for hours on every account. Well, of course, this number, 300,000 troops to be deployed in Europe, which will, shaken the very foundations of the existing, if any, left order, international order, especially this part of the world, because things have changed quite rapidly, even after 2014, as Charles also mentioned. After the illegal annexation of Crimea, well, people's expectations were like, things gonna be right after some time and they'll be put back on track and some middle ways could be found. But I believe things are not getting any better and getting worse, and we don't know till when and how worse, what kind of situations we will be seeing in the coming months and years, if not decades, because this current situation, and there's a very tragic incident that took place today. There was missile fired on in a shopping center in Kiev or Ukraine somewhere. So I couldn't catch the news late because I was just arriving in Madrid. Jens Stoltenberg, from Norway, and he was always known as, and at least presented and perceived as, a person who was a cool-headed person, making a balanced statements. And when there was some inflammation in the international affairs and some developments, he was making statements to bring the situation back to normal. But over the past several months, especially since the start of the war or invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the NATO Secretary General is the first and the foremost person making such statements that really diminish hopes of people like myself, at least, that a middle way can be found between Russia and the West. Because from what Charles also mentioned, and everybody knows, all the direct and indirect consequence of what is happening on everything, every aspect of life and everywhere, not only just this part of the world. So therefore, we were expecting the parties, taking such measures or not, taking some steps that would further exacerbate tension. The situation like that, and I don't know what is it that really is in the minds of the policymakers in pouring so many tens of or hundreds of thousands of troops and putting so many boots on the ground. And are we going to a war? And are we going to see battlefields where NATO troops will be involved or engaged? Why is it that in this many troops are being transferred to the continent or from within the continent, not only from US and Canada, and also from Germany and other countries that are contributing and are going to contribute to the formation of this many troops on the ground? So I believe we should not forget the fact that, there are many, many other issues. Of course, the tragedy aside, human tragedy and economic consequences for energy situation, everything. But there are also other international political issues that requires close cooperation and coordination between West and Russia in particular, such as the international security regimes, such as arms control regimes, disarmament regimes, nuclear non-proliferation regime. Just it's around the corner, the NPT review conference, which was postponed several times because of the pandemic, and this August, it will take place hopefully, and there will be no possibility of finding a middle ground or publishing a final communique, a final document on which both parties and all the participating states could feel like the future of nuclear non-proliferation regime is not bleak as many people argue these days because of the failure in 2015, the previous review conference. If there is another failure coming in this NPT review conference, people's faith in the nuclear non-proliferation regime will be deteriorated, will be diminished, and many countries may choose to go their own way to pursue nuclear weapons. And a world with more nuclear weapons with nuclear weapons capable state at least, will not be a safer place. So Russia's contribution, collaboration is therefore required. And of course, I'm not saying that United States and Western alliance should yield to the Russian threatening statements or should accept or agree with what they do in Ukraine. This is not the case, but I don't see the logic behind pouring 300,000 troops on the ground as if this is going to be a conventional war between West and Russia. We should not forget the fact that Russia has more than 6,000 nuclear weapons many of which, like 4,000 of which, are deployed and actionable. So there's also this issue of international terrorism, and especially when the Warsaw Pact collapsed and the Soviet Union dissolved, everybody asked why NATO survives. I mean, why is it that NATO still is around? And like Charles also mentioned at the beginning, NATO was established to protect the Western lifestyle. Western lifestyle means individual democracies, individual liberties, democratic regimes, open market economies. And back then, the Soviet Union was threatening these values of the West. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was regional disagreements and some regional affairs, as well as international terrorism. And NATO has transformed itself from an area defense organization to a collective security organization at the global scale. And with high mobility, higher power, firepower, and much more sophisticated intelligence capabilities and everything. And the fight against international terrorism was at the forefront of everything else. But we seem to, the image that I get from the statements being made, from the concentration of topics, and also issues that have been mentioned as they are going to be raised during the 2 or 3 day summit with respect to the next strategy concept, it's as if international terrorism is not so highly regarded, which I'm afraid we may really regret thinking that way if this is the case. So I believe the concept should, of course, pay attention to Russian atrocities, Russian threatening statement, Russian invasion, or what they may have Russian ambitions with respect to the future regarding the Eurasian landscape, or maybe even the entire Western Europe as well. But on the other hand, NATO leaders should not forget the fact that it's not all about Russia and Ukraine. I mean, of course, Ukrainian tragedy being the most important issue, but all other issues are, if not equally, but at least gradually quite important. So I would like to underline this issue at the beginning.
Okay, thank you, both of you, for your initial remarks and providing such extensive sort of framework for our audience. I want to ask you, Charles, so when we look at the 2010 document, there's no mention of China. There is a dialogue, reference to dialogue with Russia. There is, the affirmation that, NATO is not a threat to Russia. And when we get to today, we are seeing very different priorities. Like you said, collective defense against Russia has become a major item here. And then Professor Kibaroğlu, kind of criticized the 300,000, troop presence throughout NATO countries, especially near Russia, in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. I would bet that most of the forces are going to be along the sort of west of Russian border.
And also Poland probably will also.
Yeah, Poland. So do you what from what we've talked about so far, what issues do you think have the staying power for NATO that they should really focus on for the medium and long term? And what issues do you think they might be overreacting? Like, let's say, Ukraine war is critically important for European security, but this 300K force structure, do you think that's appropriate, adequate? Will it kind of deter Russia? Because for Russia to be deterred by NATO, I think it may not be the conventional forces, but more the nuclear capabilities that Professor Kibaroğlu discussed. What do you think?
Well, just to clarify, the number that Stoltenberg is putting out there of 300,000, or we don't know exactly where it will land. these are forces that would be at higher states of readiness, that they would be able to deploy. We're not looking at NATO actually deploying those kinds of numbers to the eastern flank. In fact, my expectation is that the numbers will remain limited, and that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was signed in 1997, that prohibited the permanent stationing of large combat troops in the new members, I'm guessing that that founding act will not be torn up at the Madrid summit. Let's wait and see. But the forces that NATO has actually deployed to the eastern flank have been relatively limited. They will increase. But what Stoltenberg was talking about was the rapid reaction force, forces that would be able to deploy if, for example, the Russians were to attempt something like a military operation in the Baltic region. I do think, however, that a lot remains to be seen. We don't know where the Ukraine war is going. We don't know when the fighting will end, and there may be some ceasefire talk and maybe follow-on diplomacy. We don't know how far the Russians will seek to go, right? It's possible that they will attempt to seize control of Luhansk and Donetsk and keep the areas they've taken in the south and stop. It's possible that they will try to move on to Odessa. Maybe they'll go back to the original plan, which seemed to have been to topple the regime in Kyiv. So where this war goes and how ambitious Russia's war aims are will, in my mind, be an indicator of how far NATO goes to increase its capability to defend against Russia and to deter Russia. But I think that Mustafa made an important point, and that is that we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We cannot just write off Russia. We need to continue the conversation about arms control, about energy, about climate, about China. There are lots of issues that will remain on the agenda that will require trying to salvage a relationship of some sort with Russia. And that's why my personal view is that NATO should try sooner rather than later to pivot in the war toward diplomacy and to marry its armament of Ukraine with a diplomatic strategy aimed at bringing this war to an end. Because the war is causing an enormous amount of destruction. The risks of escalation go up as the war continues. We desperately need to get Ukrainian grain onto international markets, onto the tables of people in Africa and elsewhere that are facing significant food shortages. So we're still very much in the uncertain phase of this war. No question in my mind that NATO will take important steps to bolster its eastern flank. How far down that road it goes, whether it actually decides to abrogate the NATO-Russia Founding Act, let's see what happens in Madrid.
Thank you, Charles. Just a quick follow-up then. You're saying, NATO has been unable to deter Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO country. And this process, you suggested that we should try to move to diplomatic phase sooner rather than later, but we don't see much of an indication on that front. Especially the US policy is now more or less, as long as Ukraine wants to fight, we will support them. And those can be reconciled to some extent, but from the NATO perspective, right, individual countries supported Ukraine, but do you think in this strategic concept they could design some sort of new approach that would deter Russia or others from, doing something in non-NATO countries that are near NATO. Does that make sense? Like, no, maybe no more Ukraine in the future. Is that even possible from the NATO's perspective?
Well, I agree with you that at least for now, the Biden administration is saying it's up to the Ukrainians. We'll arm them for as long as they want to fight. On the other hand, as you both know, Turkey, Germany, France, Italy, other members of NATO are floating ideas that are at least oriented toward opening up some kind of diplomatic dialogue and having not just a strategy of armament, but a strategy of diplomacy to go with it. I don't have a good sense as to where that debate is across the Atlantic. I do think that maintaining transatlantic unity is essential. It is the strongest suit of NATO. It's not the HIMARS, it's not the artillery, it is the unity that the US and its allies have shown in standing up to Russia. And I think the deterrent effect has been quite impressive. The Russians have been pushed back. They have been rebuffed from their initial war aims. They are suffering very significant pain economically. They just defaulted on a loan payment for the first time in 100 years. They are facing the likely prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So I think the deterrent effect has been quite strong, and I think other countries are watching this carefully. But again, I think we're at a fluid moment, and I do think that over time, because of the domestic economic effects of the war, pressure will grow to marry the strategy of armament with a strategy of diplomacy.
Thank you. I was referring to deterrence in the case of Ukraine, stopping Russia in Ukraine, but you're right. Russia hasn't been able to expand. If anything, it had to, reduce actually the area that it was initially setting out to conquer. Professor Kibaroğlu. Yeah.
Just one quick sentence to follow, because you did ask about the sort of gray zone countries that are not in NATO. And we see, I think, the outlines of a strategy that could involve neutrality, security assurances from the West, and EU membership. That appears to be the path that Ukraine might be heading in.
Thank you. Professor Kibaroğlu, similar question to you. What can NATO really do in terms of collective defense within NATO? It's relatively straightforward, I guess. Reaffirming the Article 5, reaffirming unity, deploying forces into NATO countries, strengthening their capabilities. That's relatively straightforward. The levels could be up to debate, but like I was asking earlier, what can NATO do about gray zone countries, as Professor Kupchan described? What do you think?
Well, actually, of course, NATO's mission is defending the NATO territory. But of course, defending NATO territory does not necessarily mean only defending territory per se. If the threat is nearby, of course, just like, for any other country, whenever you talk with the strategist, defense starts from, abroad, from afar. It's not just the, immediate border. Therefore, it's quite understandable as to why NATO has displayed, not only now, in the past as well, developing partnership for peace operations and, Gulf cooperation, cooperation with Gulf countries, Australia, New Zealand, and almost everywhere there was this global partnership. And of course, with, at the back of minds of the strategists, NATO planners, one of the issues was international terrorism, just like I mentioned previously. But of course, when it comes to real fighting or the heat of the fighting, as it gets closer, every country will start, thinking in terms of its own national interest. And if there's going to be, if the gray zone turns out to be a hot, confrontation zone, of course, countries, rhetorical statements might change from, sending messages or some, general words to more specific statements that might, distinguish their position from their previous positions as to where they were, looking like supporting, NATO's overall attitude. That is the case today. So when it comes to, whether Russia has been successful or whether it's a failure, I would like to say something that I've been thinking for a while, because, I think when, just before the war started on 24th of February this year, I was thinking that Russia could hold its position. I mean, there was this talk about 127,000 troops right across the border in Donbas area, and that, they were, many people thought they could stay there forever almost because, it's their homeland. I mean, the Russian territory, and they could, support and logistical support, provide everything they need. And I was not expecting Putin to really move in and start the war. And either he made a strategic mistake or we made a strategic mistake in terms of thinking that, Putin would not go in such a short notice, but he did. And then he learned a lesson. Now what he's doing is, he's almost strengthening its positions and making some sort of reorganization and thinking over the situation, and maybe changes in the ranks of the generals and all the other staff officers. And he feels like he has the upper hand, because Russia is now controlling much more Ukrainian territory before the beginning of the war. And with the beginning of the war, now Ukrainian territory is under Russian control without a fight these days. Literally, there is no active fight, as it has been the case over the past couple of months. So I think Putin might be acting now as in the way that I was expecting him to act. To stand still for a long while and turn this into some sort of a nerve war. Who is more passionate, who is more sort of calm, who can control his passion, and look at what the West is going to do, and then at some point when he thinks that it's the right time, might escalate the confrontation or the operations again. So this means such acts like sending in troops 300,000 or making them ready to be sent over to the to some of the countries, to the Western European territory, actually doesn't make too much a difference in terms of perceptions, because put yourself in the shoes of a Russian strategist, and how would you read this message, 300,000 whether they are in their home countries to be readily deployed or quickly deployed overseas, or just over several hundred kilometers away from their homes, or whether they are now on the terrain. So it doesn't make too much a difference from the Russian perspective in terms of reading the West's interest. So therefore, I think it is like Charles also mentioned, we have to marry these strategies with diplomacy. It's too late. It's already too late. And every step we make, the West makes in terms of escalating this troop presence and military operations, will make it much harder to come back to positions where there might be some middle ground. And because we have the whole world must turn back to the arms control agenda, disarmament agenda, international terrorism, fighting international terrorism agenda, things like that are of equal, if not more important, for the security of the whole world, not just one region.
Thank you, Professor Kibarol. Charlie, if you don't have anything else to add to this, I want to turn to your earlier discussion about China. So NATO, in terms of collective defense, now Russia is the main thing, but I guess on the level of aspirations and perhaps a bit more from the American perspective, China is the emerging threat in its capabilities, technology and military capabilities, and etc. But it's China, dealing with China is going to require NATO to be active or have initiatives beyond Europe, continental Europe. Perhaps Sweden and Finland's inclusion could open up a new territory of competition in the Arctic, perhaps, that could have implications for China. But beyond that, we've seen in the past NATO operations in Afghanistan, today in Iraq. Outside Europe, there have been operations, but they've been rather limited. So when it comes to China, you said it earlier, we're not going to send NATO troops to South China Sea. You don't see that happening anytime soon. How do you think then NATO, by talking about China, addressing the China challenge, what are the things that NATO can offer on that front, or what it can try to do?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be mindful of the degree to which the war in Ukraine is distracting from a US strategy that probably would have otherwise been focused much more on China. And that the war in Ukraine is not canceling the so-called pivot to Asia, but it's certainly slowing it down. And that's because more US troops, aircraft, ships are flowing to Europe that might otherwise have been flowing to the Asia Pacific. And if you just think about the time and the energy that the Biden administration is deploying to deal with the war in Ukraine, that's time and energy that, at least for now, is not being spent focused on China. But I do think that there will be a continuing desire by the United States and among Europeans to focus more on China. So here are just a few ideas to put out there. One is, I think it's important for NATO to capitalize on the readiness of its European members to spend more on defense. Right, the decision by Germany to put 100 billion euros into its military and to meet the 2% of GDP NATO benchmark, that's a big deal. And I do think that over time, there must be a stronger European pillar. Not because the United States is going to leave Europe and head off to the Asia Pacific, but because this will enable Europe to shoulder more responsibility as the United States picks up more burdens in other regions. Secondly, NATO has developed very important partnership activities. And to the best of my knowledge, I haven't checked in the last few days, but I believe that South Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand will be at the NATO summit as observers. And that's a sign that NATO is going to play a role in training and sharing best practices. Maybe what we'll see is something that I'm not expecting an Asian NATO. I'm not expecting that suddenly you're going to see a counter China alliance emerge, but I do think that NATO can share lessons with countries in the region that are dealing with China. And then, even though I don't expect to see a NATO mission deployed to the region, on other issues, cybersecurity, how to respond to Belt and Road, how much Chinese investment should we allow in our countries? What about the repatriation of supply lines in sensitive areas? These are the kinds of issues where I think NATO can play an important role as a consultative body in aligning US and European policies on China.
Thank you, Charlie. Those are quite specific and on 5G, the United States tried to convince European partners, mostly successfully, I believe, to refuse sort of Chinese investment in Europe. There have been other successful stories like that. But I guess what you're imagining is when it comes to sort of conventional defense, they would need to rely on or help regional, like the Quad, you mentioned regional organizations, perhaps. Professor Kibaroğlu, how do you see that China angle for NATO?
Yeah, as you said, Kadir, there was not a single word about China back in 2010 strategic concept, but only a couple of years ago that China has been put on the text in the final document after the 2018, I guess, summit meetings. And and behind that, I believe the important factor that made China feature on NATO's final documents was the US perception of China. And because there is this talk of pivot to China for quite a number of years, and there is this talk as to whether China should be the most important topic for the US interest, although this military dimension is not as worrisome as the case with Russia and other places or international terrorism. And of course, there's this unpreventable rise of China to the very top on every account, from financial, economic issues to military and technological issues, almost everything. And if regional security issues or cultural security issues or hard security issues are behind the Russian behaviors, Russian moves, and opting to preferring some hard power instruments in solving or trying to solve its problems, such as the case in Ukraine. We know that Russia has objected for decades to Ukraine's potential NATO membership, as was the case with Georgia, and we have seen back in 2008 a short-lived war, a Russian war towards Georgia, and this time Russia acted with some security considerations. But when it comes to China, my reading of China is not that China is being motivated with hard security issues, or not military issues are not necessarily the number one factors behind what kind of foreign policy decisions they are taking. In my personal opinion, the number one issue is feeding its 1.5 billion people. China's leaders' number one issue, from my perspective, is to feed their own people. Starting from the 60s and 70s, buying or renting lands or developing good relations with countries along overseas in Latin America, in Africa, for organic, agricultural, business, or and this Belt and Road, it's all economic, and keeping the highways of economic and commercial activities open so as to get money, currency, in order to buy whatever products are necessary for his own people. Chinese leaders are, in my opinion, are motivated by these factors rather than controlling more territories for the sake of controlling some strategic hotposts. So therefore, I think if we raise the stakes in the military domain with China, China is equally, if not, of course, as much as powerful as Russia or United States. They are still a nuclear power and strategic nuclear weapons that they have, and they have also other capabilities, especially the Navy, which is not matched with the decreasing or diminishing US Navy over the past couple of decades. So therefore, instead of pushing military issues in this direction as well, I mean, I think trying to understand and try to find ways as to how to mitigate the fears of Chinese leaders in terms of how to feed their own people and how to, construct an economic, world order that would serve China's interests, and so they could diminish their tension and their sort of concerns, and maybe find more peaceful relations. Otherwise, if more military issues, if they are pushed more, I think China can take all the measures, especially with its navies. And we know there is this AUKUS thing in between UK, US, and Australia, and they are going to sell nuclear submarines to Australia, which can stand, some sort of a deterrence capability towards, Chinese overseas presence in the South China Sea and the Pacific. But these are not things that can help if it comes to real military confrontation. We still should bear in mind that we are talking about countries that have quite a number of nuclear weapons, almost each of which are tens or if not hundreds of times more powerful than Hiroshima bombs. So therefore, these are serious issues. And let us not forget, this might be the last word, maybe time is getting short. I mean, wars are not broken out but intentionally. There is this misunderstanding, inadvertent activities or technical failures. So, I mean, if we push towards the edge, the probability of making a mistake or misunderstanding will increase, and I don't even want to think about the possible consequences, horrible consequences that might take place after. People might say, "Oops, what kind of mistake we did?" But it's too late.
Thank you, Professor Kibaroğlu. I'll just make a comment, but I want to. You're free to respond to it at the end if you like. But I guess the Russian example, using the nuclear sort of capacity for the benefit of its sort of conventional aims, right? In the case of Ukraine, that we have seen that's possible. So in many, you're saying that conventional capabilities at the end of the day become meaningless if you're a nuclear power, right? That's true in the case of China as well. But then we have Putin in very much sort of in a way he used that advantage to enter Ukraine. Perhaps that could be an example for Taiwan. I won't let you respond to that because we are running out of time, but at the end, if you want to say a sentence, that's fine. I want to quickly ask Charlie, there's a question from the audience about China acquiring DNA data of Western citizens, and that what can sort of NATO do about anything about that? Can NATO do anything about that? And then I'll very quick answer if you can, and then I'll ask my final questions to both of you.
Sure. Just a quick comment on that. China is sort of developing facial recognition technology and other kinds of biometric technologies that are creating a surveillance state, and they are selling those technologies to others. And I think that it is important that the US, its European allies, and others take steps to prevent heading down that road. But there's also the flip side, and in some ways I think it's a more important flip side, and that is we need to be able to compete with China across the board on quantum computing, on AI. And therefore, I think one of the conversations we should be having in NATO, and it may not be the right forum, but it's certainly some kind of transatlantic conversation, is how can we make sure our societies outperform autocracies. And that may require good, smart investments in the tech sector, in R&D, and getting broadband internet into new parts of the country. Biden, in my mind, was on the right track when he's spent so much time and energy on this issue. We need to make sure that that conversation continues across the Atlantic in a coordinated way.
Okay, I want to pose you my last question, something a bit more practical. You've been in the government. These documents, strategic documents, framework documents, how important are they on day-to-day running of government business? Do documents have to somehow go back and refer to them? And then how do you take guidance from these documents? How important are they, do you think?
Interesting question, Kadir. And, and you could say the same thing about the US national security strategy or a British white paper. I would say that they do matter. And one of the ways that they matter is that they force organizations to clarify their thinking. And the near production of NATO 2030 is getting NATO officials, the International Secretariat, the people that work there, the General Secretary and others to confront tough issues and to answer them in a way that they can write down. To put it differently, these exercises clarify the mind. Now, can we read the strategic concept and find out everything that we need to know about NATO for the next 10 years? No. Right? And that's because the world is a messy place. Had this strategic concept come out 6 months ago, right, we wouldn't have even mentioned Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And the Ukraine war is completely changing NATO. So it's an important document in that it clarifies the mind, it provides strategic direction, but who knows what other events could change NATO's direction, just like 9/11 did.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to give the last word to Professor Kibaroğlu on the same question, as well as anything else you would like to address, please.
Thank you, Kadir, for this opportunity. Well, of course, such documents, framework, documents are sort of showing the way, are expressions of the will, general will, and the intentions, and they put on the table some set of principles, norms, rules, and how to take decisions. But they also leave some leeways. I mean, some openings whereby if it doesn't fit the expectations of the administrations, they can get away with it and not to necessarily bind themselves with the stringence of these documents. Even look at Article 5, NATO Article 5. It's no matter whom you ask this question, everybody, if they don't know nothing about NATO, they know Article 5. And when you read Article 5, you can see actually how weak it is, because the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America, I'm reading it, shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of UN, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith individually or in concert with the other parties such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. So it talks about assisting the country if it deems necessary, and if it might include use of armed force. I mean, from the outset, from outside, Article 5 is like, one attack on one against, it's an attack against all, but it's when you read the text, it's not that powerful, and it gives the opportunity to some states to really, back down and not necessarily be, on the ground for active contribution.
It's not a triggering item in many ways.
So therefore, administrations may say, well, this fits my expectations. I agree with the text, but 5 years later, they might say, well, I disagree with this part, I disagree with this clause, and then it's all out of the window.
Well, let's hope. Every document NATO members keep affirming that, and President Trump had chosen not to, and that was a big deal in the U.S. context. But I don't think we have a lot of time to discuss that today. Maybe in the future we'll continue to discuss NATO issues. And I want to once again thank both Professor Kupcan and Professor Kibaroğlu to join me today discussing NATO's strategic concept that is about to be released in Madrid, Spain during the NATO Summit. I want to thank our participants on Zoom and social media. Thanks for following us. Much appreciated.
Thanks for
I'll see
inviting
you
me.
all
Good
next
to
time.
see you all.
Thank you, Kadir. Good to see you,
You
Mustafa.
too. Thank
see
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.